Cervical vertebrae. These are smaller than the thoracic and lumbar. They support less weight. Now, the general structure, you're going to have the spinous process. Here you can see the transverse processes right there. And what's unique to cervical vertebrae, they're the only ones that have transverse foramen. See those extra holes? That's unique to cervical vertebrae. That's a passageway for the artery and veins. Well, it's actually the vertebral artery and veins and nerves that pass through those vertebral foramen. The one exception, I think it's C7. It actually passes around the vertebral foramen and not through it. Here's your superior articular process with the superior articular facet. Again, the spinous process is oriented downward. So these would be the inferior articular process with the inferior articular facet. You can see that facet's nice and smooth. So superior process, inferior process, superior articular facet, inferior articular facet, vertebral foramen, vertebral foramen. Basically, it's a general structure. The one difference would be the transverse foramen. Again, that's the passageway for the vertebral artery and veins. C1 and C2 are unique. They are still cervical vertebrae. You can see they do have the transverse foramen. C1, they call this C1 because, or it's a C1, they call it the Atlas, because Atlas holds up your head. In Greek mythology, you've probably seen statues of a man holding up the earth. So the Atlas is a special name for C1. And C2 has a special name as well. It's called the axis, because things turn on an axle. That's how they actually articulate. You'll learn more about that in Chapter 8 on joints. But anyhow, let's talk a little bit about C1. I mentioned previously about general structure. You won't see a spinous process or a body on C1. Instead, you have the anterior arch and you have the posterior arch. That's the mass of bone that connects the lateral masses, which is this mass of bone here and here. Transverse processes with transverse foramen, anterior arch. Inside on the anterior arch, you have what's called the fovea dentis, or facet for the dens, right there. You can see that's a smooth articulation point. That's going to articulate with the dens. Right there. That's going to form the pivot joint of the neck. And if you may recall, the occipital condyles are kind of rounded. Well, the superior articular, they still refer to this as a facet. It is rounded like the occipital condyle, so that's the superior surface. The inferior is flat. So these are inferior articular facets. They're flat. So posterior arch, anterior arch, fovea dentis or facet for the dens, transverse processes, transverse foramen. And when you look at the axis, he does have a body. There's the body. He does have a spinous process. I say he because to me it looks like a little superhero. Spinous process. My hands are in the way. You can see the transverse process with the transverse foramen right there, the hole. Superior articular facet, which is flat, like the inferior of the atlas. That's how it articulates. What I mean by pivot joint, that does rotational movements of the head. This is called the dens or odontoid process. I'll accept either or. There's the body. Inferior articular facet on the inferior articular process. So again, once you get the general structure of the vertebrae down, there's just basically a few modifications. But you should know how these articulate. The dens is facing forward. That is the anterior portion up here. So when your neck turns, like in saying yes and no, it's going to rotate like that. Your occipital condyles with the C1 or atlas. And the occipital condyles is for shaking your head yes, no, or tilting it side to side. So C1 on the right, C1, or the atlas, C2 axis. And there's your anterior views right there. You can see all cervical vertebrae still have this transverse foramen.